Hello and welcome. I'm Jessi Sheslow, the Director of Community Relations at the Jewish Federation of Sarasota-Manatee. Thank you for joining this Heller CRC webinar, Israeli Politics 101. I'm excited to have a valued member of the Heller Community Relations Committee here with us today as our guest presenter, David Weiman. The Jewish Federation of Sarasota-Manatee's mission is to strengthen Jewish life and identity in our community, provide for Jewish people in need, and promote support for Israel. Therefore, we are thrilled to provide our community with new and innovative programs virtually, especially in this time of such uncertainty. This webinar, Israeli Politics 101, is to help you better understand how the Israeli political system is set up. This will also serve as a primer for our next Heller CRC webinar with the Israeli Embassy in Washington, D.C. and the Consulate in Miami. They will do a deeper dive into the current political environment in Israel and how the coronavirus is affecting it. Please watch your inboxes for more information, including date and time. Let me introduce our guest today. David Weiman was born and raised in Haifa, Israel, where he lived for 19 years. He is passionate about Israeli politics and Israel advocacy. David participated in AIPAC's Charles and Lynn Schusterman advocacy training in Washington, D.C., Aish HaTorah's Hasbara Fellowship's advocacy training in Israel, and advocacy training by Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. David also graduated from the Israel Center for Political Training in 2011, Israel's only institute training for careers in the KNESSET as parliamentary and ministerial staff and speakers. An alum of Ohio State University, David organized and was vocal in campus efforts to counter BDS and its precursor, PSM, Palestine Solidarity Movement, during the Second Intifada. David currently works as a business broker and realtor at Wagner Realty. Together with his wife Priya, they are parents to 18-month-old daughter Kochav. After David presents, we will go to questions. You may ask at any time during the presentation. Please use the chat box to do so. This webinar is being recorded. You are watching Heller CRC's Israeli Politics 101. David, all yours.
Thank you, Jessi. I appreciate the warm welcome and the introduction. I am very excited to get started, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. This is, as Jessi mentioned, meant to be a very introductory lecture into Israeli politics. And so we'll cover the basics and leading up to the follow-up presentations you will have with the embassy and consulate later on. As Jessi mentioned, she went over my bio, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. The Knesset is a singular and only parliament that Israel has. It's a one parliament system. Here we can see the building that was completed in 1966 that was designed for this sole use. And as you can see, even the seating is shaped as a menorah. They are proud to use the Jerusalem stone that you see throughout Jerusalem. And so it's supposed to really represent the country. And here on the far left, you have the State of Israel's symbol along with the Knesset's new symbol. Enacting laws is only part of what the Knesset does. It is the legislative arm, though it also appoints judges through a special committee. It elects the prime minister and president themselves, and it performs other key functions, oversight over the judiciary, and other things that we may be familiar from other political systems. Being a single parliamentary system, everything is done in that one building, and it is a residual from the British political system. 1920 to 1948 was a British mandate where it was basically a colony or a territory of the Brits. And many of the rules and things are left over from there. The prime minister is the head of state. That is, of course, currently Benjamin Netanyahu. And the president is a ceremonial position that represents the country both internally and externally, but does not hold any political power. It is almost always a former politician that holds that position. There are 120 seats in Knesset. The seats are divided proportionately based on the percentage of votes given to each party. The minimum threshold has been changed over time, and it is currently 3.25% of the total votes, which equates to 4 seats in parliament. So if people get anything under that, those votes are not counted, and that party is ineligible to enter Knesset. You cannot enter with 3 or fewer seats. Creating a government requires multiple parties to enter jointly into a governing agreement in a coalition. The ministerial positions are divided amongst those different parties, and so you may often find a party that's pulling in one direction that may have maybe the Secretary of Education, for example, and a party with a completely opposing agenda that's part of the same coalition that may have the judiciary or the agriculture portfolio. 61 or more seats are required to form the government. You must have a simple majority. There are different points and possibilities that we will get to in which a government can be dissolved early and the Knesset itself can be dispersed, and therefore defaulting to elections. Of course, the larger the government is, the more seats they have in Knesset, the more stable it will be, and the easier it will be for them to enact laws. The Knesset originally convened in February 14th, 1949, no relation to Valentine's Day, I assure you it is coincidental only, after the January 20th, 1949 elections. They replaced the Provisional State Council that governed from the Declaration of Statehood in May 1948 and onwards. After several temporary meeting places, both in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, the Knesset had a permanent home from 1950 to 1966 on King George Street, and that is still a landmark till this day. So anyone visiting Jerusalem is more than welcome to have a look and snap a picture. The incoming Knesset now is the 23rd in Israel's 72 years. So as opposed to the average term, the regular term being for 4 years, we can see that most Israeli governments on average have lasted 3.2 years and not their full term. The law establishing elections in Israel is quite interesting and dates back to that 1949 very beginning of legislating new rules in the newly born state of Israel. So that law is called the Basic Law Establishing the Knesset. It specifies 6 election requirements, which sound relatively simple, but it's quite a bit to take in. And it actually is very, very symbolic and very important. Each one of these 6 words dictates a lot. So saying it's a general election means that all Israelis 18 and up can vote if they're in the country or on official business overseas. This does not have any exclusions whatsoever. If you can prove you're an Israeli and you're over 18 in the country or on official business, you can vote. There is nothing to bar you under any circumstance. There are national elections, so the country is a single electoral constituency. A vote cast in one town or in one complete end of the country makes absolutely no difference at the end of the day versus a different one. Where it's cast does not matter. One vote gets one count. A direct election is interesting in the fact that the Knesset is voted directly by the voters. There are no electors that are then elected or appointed to vote on behalf of the people's wishes. The people vote themselves. The equal part is that all votes carry an equal weight. Secret is, of course, that voting is done in secrecy to avoid any undue coercion. And the proportional aspect is that seats are divided proportionally by the percentage of the total national vote, as we had covered previously. Election Day is a national day, a holiday in Israel, to enable all potential voters to participate. This has been a very unusual time where we had 3 elections in about a year and a half. So those folks everyone did get 3 additional national holidays, days off to vote and to then hopefully enjoy with the rest of their family while they're anxiously anticipating results. And free public transportation is available. That is only available to folks that actually live, may have moved from when they were registered last or things like that to where they would actually not live directly near their polling station. Polling stations are assigned based on where you live, and as they are here, are usually done in schools, post offices, libraries, and other public buildings that are accessible and easily identifiable. Israeli law does not provide for absentee ballots. So if you decide to leave Israel and are not on official business, if it's a vacation or otherwise, you are deciding to forfeit your vote until the next voting election. Polling begins as early as 12 days before election days, specifically only for those abroad. And again, diplomatic embassies, consulates around the world, even ships that are transiting the world with important vital goods. All those people are able to vote, and therefore they vote earlier. So the hope is that those votes come in time or soon thereafter once the rest of the votes are tallied. Soldiers on active duty vote in the polling stations that are in their units. So there is no national security issue with shutting down. Going on election does not mean that now no one's protecting the country, God forbid, or there are no airplanes in the air preventing something bad from happening. All those folks are able to vote within their units. They don't have to go off base or anything. And that is all done securely and validated. Particular arrangements are made for prison inmates, as well as those that may be confined to hospitals or are limited and are unable to move around freely. Anyone over 21 can run for parliament and therefore also be eligible for a ministerial position or even a prime minister, except the holders of certain high government positions or certain high military positions that are required to resign their posts prior to engaging in an election. Felons that have been sentenced to 3 or more years in prison and it has not yet been 7 years since they're released are also ineligible for running. The voting process is where you have to identify yourself by a valid government ID. Those are issued for free to all Israelis aged 16 and above, and Israelis are mostly required or asked to have that available if needed. So it is not more Israelis carry around an ID than Americans that would have a driver's license or otherwise. Everyone in Israel has a government ID, and if you lose it or anything else, it's free to get another one. Each voter is given one envelope upon entering the voting booth. And inside the booth, as you can see, I have a sample here. You literally have slips of every single paper for each party. Each party is represented by their main letters or party symbol, if you will, and the full party name is written underneath to assist. These folks that may be newer immigrants to Israel that require assistance have that provided to them, and same with accommodations that are made for everyone. And so once a voter is in the booth, you are allowed to take only one of these slips and place it in your envelope that you had been given. You seal the envelope yourself, so no one sees what slip you choose, but you are then walk out of the booth into plain sight of everyone in the room, the poll workers, the attorneys that are making sure everything is done well, and other voters. And other voters can see you drop, as we can see at the top of the page here, your envelope into the box. No one knows who you're voting for as the envelope is sealed. Of course, when votes are tallied, the election officials are making sure that each envelope has only one vote in it. If anyone tries to stuff an envelope with multiple votes, if they're all for the same party, then only the one is counted. If they have several different ones in there, whether by accident or on purpose, then that whole envelope does not get counted. There are 10,000 polling stations nationally. That's of course a little bit, it's a rough number, but they are throughout the kibbutzim, throughout, like as we said, the hospitals, bases, everywhere else. So folks do not have to inconvenience themselves to vote. The idea is that people have access and ability to vote as much as possible. The polls are open 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. therefore, and that is, again, to accommodate voting. An election can be triggered by several things besides the regular expiration of a term limit, which is 4 years. The other possibilities for causing an election are if a Knesset passes a bill to disperse, maybe for inability to move forward on certain needs or certain blocks, or as we see now, possibly a national emergency because of health situations or national security or economic conditions. That has all happened in the past. The Knesset fails to approve the budget within 3 months of the start of the financial year, automatically triggers the need for an election. They do not want to keep operating with a budget that is left over from the past. And so passing the budget there is huge. The Prime Minister can request the Knesset to disperse at any time. That is, of course, quite a powerful tool. But again, when you are the Prime Minister, it's not very likely that you will ask to disperse the Knesset and request elections because, again, you're risking your seat. So you're only going to do this under relatively certain terms that you will keep or augment your power or size of your party and coalition partners in the election, and therefore needs to be exercised very, very carefully. And a vote of no confidence, if a vote of no confidence is passed by the Knesset, it can be introduced by the opposition, and it's enough that just a few members of coalition possibly join, or other things like that. And if a new government is not formed within the required timeline, that automatically requires elections. So that is, those are the different conditions. Candidates can be disqualified from participating. It is not done often, and it is not something that I think anyone wants to see too often. It's used in the most extreme circumstances. And there are three, by law, there are three categories for why someone can be disqualified. If there's a negation of the state of Israel as a state of the Jewish people, that would have to be very explicit, and it really rarely to never is applied. Definitely, I don't recall that in the last 20 or 30 years whatsoever. And the negation of the democratic character of Israel. Also, there are some parties that may propose other systems of government, but they do that within the democratic framework, and therefore that is also something that is not exercised. The incitement to racism clause is the one that is most commonly and almost exclusively used because it is an issue with the fringes of the most extreme fringes of the political map on both sides. We had a party that did not pass the threshold, the minimum of 4 seats this time, that is on the far right, that has had very questionable actions, routes, and even sayings and actions, in respect to the Arab population of Israel, which of course is a respected minority within Israel, and of course, and also with the most extreme parts of an Arab party that have also had issues with is their incitement to racism with some implicit or tacit support of possible violent activity against Israel. So those are the two that are often exercised. Both of those issues came up in this election, as they do in every election, because anyone or any nonprofit, anyone can appeal and challenge, say, I don't think this person represents, or I think this person violated these three, or a whole list. A whole party can be disqualified if they are grossly violating any of this. All that can be appealed to the Supreme Court, any decision, and the Supreme Court can and often does reverse decisions. So the elections committee themselves will often say this party may not move forward, or this particular candidate may not move forward, but the rest of the party can. And the Supreme Court may and often will overturn that. And they did this time around as well. So the person that was barred from running initially was then allowed to run, and she will now be part of the Knesset in the upcoming Knesset. The most recent elections were March 2nd. This has been quite a challenging time for anyone that's following Israeli politics or voting. Even if you are just a layperson going to vote, you are getting quite a bit of exercise over the past year and a half with 3 elections. This has never happened before. So the April 2019 election was an end of a term. That's a normal time for an election. The reason we've had other subsequent elections, 2 more since then, there are multiple issues. The main glaring part that is sticking out is, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been under investigation and then since then been indicted on several counts. And that has been an issue and also a opening and opportunity, a moment of opportunity for some other parties to possibly come in. Israel Beitenu is a right-wing party that is normally right-wing of Likud, farther to the right, and always is part of Likud governments. They have refused to join him in a coalition for these last 3 election cycles. And as soon as a major part of your coalition like that is no longer going to participate with you, you either have to replace them or you are in trouble because you do not have enough seats to support your government. The March elections formed Israel's 23rd Knesset. We had 71.5% voter turnout, which for recently in Israel is relatively high. Historically, voter turnout has been higher and then dropped probably starting in the 90s a little bit. There are 8 parties that won seats in the Knesset and overcame that threshold, the minimum threshold of 3.25% of the 29 parties that ran in the election. To be a party that runs and to qualify, you just need to submit the required amount of signatures and meet some basic criteria. So much so that the bottom 5 of the 29 parties that participated garnered less than 500 votes in a country of almost 6 million votes cast. So the relatively low number of parties, it sounds funny, I know 8 parties being low, the Knesset has had 11 before, and I think even 12. As we will see soon, some parties, the larger ones, have a national broad agenda that cover economic philosophy, outlook on national security, on negotiations with the neighbors, etc. And some parties are more sectorial, even single issue parties. There's a party that's so specific as in fighting for divorced dads' rights or fighting for handicap accessibility and rights and extra benefits. And those, may be valid points, and therefore those parties may garner some votes, but they represent a very narrow preference and may or may not have other agendas. So the current main parties, so the results of this last election, which was highly contested, birthed these 8 parties that are going to be in Knesset now. The Likud party garnered the most amount of votes on their own with 29.46% of the vote, which equates to 36 seats in the 120-seat parliament. So less than, just over half of what would be required. And as you can see, the next one is very close with blue and white. So no party can form their own government. No party has ever been able to form a government by itself in Israel's history. So that's not unusual. But we have here, all the leaders of the parties, the number of seats they have, and the percentage of votes. Blue and white is a new party to politics as of these last 3 election cycles. So it was formed, we're going to discuss that a little bit more. It was formed before the April 2019 vote out of three parties that combined their power and ran together. That's not unusual for parties to run together to both pass that minimum threshold, but also to try to increase their power. So that's what we can see here. We will explain each party shortly. The general background for Israeli politics is very, very important because it has been a bipolar system in the past. And in many ways may become one again. Historically, Israel has been dominated by the 2 parties, Labor being the major one, and the one that completely dominated politics from Israel's inception all the way until 1977, all prime ministers were from the Labor Party. So if David Ben-Gurion, Levi Eshkol, Golda Meir, anyone that you know of before 77, all labor. It grew out of the kibbutz movement. It is a social democratic, of course, very Zionist party that is that's been associated with the center left. They do very well used to do very well in Tel Aviv and the areas around there, as well as, of course, the kibbutzim and that movement. Since 77, the labor prime ministers have been Rabin, Peres, and Ehud Barak, as recently as 01, and for a total of 8 prime ministers. So this party's really dominated Israel politics. And of course, this party is the party of Rabin and Peres that made peace with Jordan and the PA. The Likud party is the other major party historically, and it is both democratic and Zionist, and as you see, as opposed to center left, is definitely associated with the center right. And as you see, we also dropped the social aspect to it. There is a difference in philosophy when it comes to economy, and so the Labor is more social democratic, and Likud is more of a free market idea. Both are more social than what we're used to here in the States, and of course, Israel has a vast amount of social support and safety net for their citizens. So Likud was founded in '73 by Menachem Begin and former General Ariel Sharon, and as you can see, the smaller towns in the periphery are very much their voting bloc. Maybe folks that are a little bit more traditional with both their Judaism and their outlook on life. Some of their prime ministers that are noted are Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, Netanyahu, Ariel Sharon. The reason I'm making the differentiation in 1977, which is very important for anyone that follows Israeli politics, is of course, you moved from a single party controlling politics entirely. And that was a very big election. It's so much so that it's called in Hebrew the Mahapach, the revolution, literally turning around of the plate. And that very much also resulted from some discontent with labor post Yom Kippur 1973. That was quite a trauma for the country as a whole. And also Prime Minister Rabin, during his first term, was forced to resign after having bank accounts that were against the law for him and his wife to hold overseas. At the time, that was against the law in Israel to make sure that there was no undue influence and nobody was just depositing dollars in Switzerland for politicians. We'd never want that. So both parties made peace with our neighbors, Egypt in 1978 under PM Begin. Also Ehud Olmert, and Sharon himself was a Likud prime minister. He left Likud to form Kadima as an existing prime minister, which had never happened before. And then his successor, Olmert, which was also a former Likud person, was also a Kadima prime minister. That party is no longer in existence. Traditionally, we have here a picture of Netanyahu during his military days. Traditionally is a right-leaning government with coalition and religious parties. It is considered more hawkish than Labor, the Labor Party, or now their inheritor, Blue and White, would be considered more dovish and possibly more willing to negotiate for a future peace process. So of course, we talked about how Likud promotes a free market economy. It is influenced heavily by the writings of Zev Jabotinsky. And of course, each of these parties does like to reference writings of previous folks, but that is a very telling part. So if folks want to look deeper into that, they'll be able to garner a lot of the background here. So Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi's legal troubles have been very challenging. They have threatened to end his political life earnestly, and we will, and that is still to be determined. In these elections, so far it seems like Netanyahu has been able to still survive and continue onwards. We are going to talk later perhaps about where the current situation holds. It is very likely that Netanyahu and Benny Gantz of the Blue and White Party will have some sort of power sharing agreement where they both will continue and become prime ministers. He is an indicted prime minister under these 3 counts for accepting gifts from foreign billionaires and soliciting positive press coverage from a media owner within Israel. This is nothing that any Israeli wants to see, I can assure you, regardless of who you support, and it is quite embarrassing. So that will be determined to see how that plays out, and that has already, weighed heavily on Netanyahu and his party. Ehud Olmert and Ariel Sharon had been former Likud members, and Likud, interestingly enough, especially since it's associated with the more hawkish viewpoint of things, and maybe being harsher on the national security stage, that has never had an IDF chief of staff to lead its party, whereas the Labour Party had multiple in Ehud Barak and Yitzhak Rabin, and now the inheritor Blue and White is led by former IDF chief of staff Benny Gantz. So this leads us into Blue and White. What's so unique about Blue and White is not only that it's led by Benny Gantz, but this is his first foray into politics. That is made possible based on the fact that he is widely liked in Israel, seen as a dependable, straightforward shooter. So folks that may be put off by some of the legal troubles of Netanyahu, or want a fresh breath of fresh air after 10 years, see him as someone that's trustworthy, that is not a politician, and will not play the dirty political game. Hopefully will have the best intentions for the populace as a whole. So it's very unusual. It has never happened before where a brand new candidate comes in and mounts a relatively successful campaign, as we saw, came very close to be the first party and is a very close second. The party was formed out of 3 parties. Yesh Atid and Telem were existing parties, as you can see on the second bullet point. And Strength for Israel was made by Gantz and some of his allies. That's a completely new part. So they all joined forces, and between the 3 parties garnered 33 votes. Roughly 15 for Strength of Israel, which is Gantz's party, 15 for Yesh Atid, headed by Yair Lapid, a very well-known former media person, and Telem, who is led also by former Chief of Staff Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, a former Likud person himself. This party is center-left leaning, would require coalition with left-leaning parties, possibly the Joint Arab List, because that party now has 15 seats, which is quite large, about 12% of the total seats in Knesset. Israel Beitenu, which would normally be a very unnatural ally, but again, since that party has determined that they will never sit with Netanyahu, that they suddenly, this is their other option, and so that suddenly becomes viable. They are unlikely to form a government with right-wing or religious parties, as those parties have formed a bloc with Netanyahu and are currently sitting in his government that's carrying over from previous elections. The secular liberal interests are represented mostly by this party now, and the majority of the voters, they are spread throughout the country, but they do dominate areas around Tel Aviv, Ra'anana, Ramat Gan, Herzliya, that whole area of the large metropolis that makes up the greater Tel Aviv area. We have a picture here of Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz. Interesting, I thought this would be a photo, because here you have Gantz, and on the left is Ehud Barak, which of course is a former PM with Labor. Here, Barak was Benjamin Netanyahu's defense minister. So you have Labor sitting in a coalition with Likud as the defense minister, and both of them together are crowning, if you will, Benny Gantz as the next IDF chief. And in a very interesting turn, and to show you how Israeli politics work, the person that is pinning the ranks on the person he's appointing to prime minister has now been challenged by that same person and very well may be replaced by that person as prime minister. Not something you see in a lot of places. To introduce some of the other parties, the Joint Arab List, represented and headed by Ayman Uda, which is a picture here on the right, is a grouping of 4 major political parties. And the major thing that unifies these parties are that they represent different aspects of the Arab population. What's important to note is, though the majority of them are self-defining as anti-Zionist, they do have very differing opinions and viewpoints of the world. So you have a part here that is represented by the National Islamic Society, which would like to see a Sharia country and adherence, definitely at least for Muslims to be able to govern themselves or in their own courts, etc. And they are sitting together with the Arab Communist Party, which, as communists do, reject religion and reject religion definitely within the state format. So these 2 parties in theory would be completely differing, but what brings them together is that they represent different parts of the Arab population. And as we saw, had these parties all had to run separately, one or more may not have made it at all. So they really did well for themselves by being able to put aside their differences and run jointly, therefore increasing their size greatly from maybe 10 seats if they all ran separately to the 15 that we can see. They often would like to see more concessions made to the Palestinian Authority, and some of them, or majority of them, identify as Palestinian, along as some may also identify as Israeli, but they definitely would identify as Palestinian people, which is there. Shas, as you can see in the middle, is Aryeh Deri. That is the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox party. It's a little bit unusual, but Israel has 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, and one is led by Sephardis and one is Ashkenazi. The folks in those communities vote almost exclusively for these parties based on advice of people, on their own opinion. It is in their self-interest. These parties both support increased funds for yeshivas, for the world of Torah, to enable their own private religious schools, and of course, salaries for the teachers, for the students. They support large welfare for large families. It's not unusual in many Arab towns for many of the Arab population to vote for Shas because they feel like they will be able to increase the stipend, if you will, the monthly stipend that every family gets per child. If you have 1 child, let's say you get $100, that's just an assumption. Then if you have 8, it's increased, of course. This party would be the one that would work to increase that. And all poor segments of the population, regardless of their religion or how religious they are, would gain from the additional welfare supplied that way. So it's not unusual to see someone that is maybe completely not in this worldview, like in some Arab populations or in some poor folks that are completely irreligious that want to vote for these parties. United Torah Judaism is headed by Yaakov Litzman, a former American immigrant, and his picture is on the bottom right. He is also the current Minister of Health, which means he is a very busy man and on TV all the time these days. Labor, Gesher, and Meretz. This is, again, a list that was by 3 different parties put together. They did not want to run separately. They always have. They don't want to run separately because they risked not making it. And as opposed to not having any seats, they do have 7. So of course, Labor traditionally was so much larger. Over time, a lot of Labor's votes have shifted either a little bit more to the center or to other parties, like it was Kadima, now it's blue and white. So therefore, blue and white is the inheritor, if you will, of the traditional labor viewpoint and voting bloc. Israel Beitenu is the interesting one because it really was formed around representing former Soviet Union immigrants, but it is right of Likud and is one of the most right-wing and hawkish parties. It was part of all Likud governments for the last 10 years. And Avigdor Lieberman, the head of the party in the middle here, was Secretary of Defense just after Barak that we saw in the previous picture. So they had quite a working relationship. Since then, Lieberman and Netanyahu had a falling out. They are very harsh critics of Netanyahu and refuse to sit with him. Arguably, this person is the reason we've kept having more elections, for better or worse. And it shows you how much power a small party can hold and how they can either dictate a deadlock or more elections or other things. Because they did have such a central position within that government. Yamina on the bottom is headed by Naftali Bennett, also son of American immigrants, and happens to be from Haifa, and Ayelet Shaked. He is the current defense minister, though that will be ended as soon as a new government is formed. And they are pro-development in Judea and Samaria, like Israel Beitenu. They their voters are mainly modern Orthodox and folks that want to be right of Likud. They oppose land for peace whenever possible and would like to pursue Israel's security through other means. At this point, I would please like to open up to any questions that you may have submitted to Jessi or that you may have, and please enjoy the interesting visuals I added in. I particularly like seeing Ben Gurion here between Rabin and Peres, because you really see the founding generation of the country that handed the reins to the next generation. Now, as we know, that generation is also mostly behind us, and now the reins are with the third generation. And soon enough will be handed onward. Golda Meir, Menachem Begin, and another picture of Rabin as chief of staff are also joining us.
Well, David, thank you so much. You and I spoke earlier about your presentation, and you said, well, a lot of this can be found on Google, but your thorough explanation of it has been so very helpful. Even the most staunch Zionist still may not understand this political system if we don't live in it. So thank you so much. Now, to those who are participating, please, if you have questions, put them in either the Q&A or the chat box, and we will try to get to as many as possible. The first question that we did receive was, how do the Druze population fit in?
That's a wonderful question. The Druze population numbers roughly a few hundred thousand, which again, in the size of the country of Israel is significant, both in voting and otherwise. And of course, they are full participants in Israeli democracy. They are full participants in Israeli military and as compulsory service. It is not negotiable. And they are, in many viewpoints of Israelis like myself, are complete partners in every aspect of life, from economic to protecting the country to making sure that Israel gets a fair shake in the world. So Druze do not have a party that only represents them. They will vote according to conscience, both for left-wing parties and right-wing parties. They participate in both, and there are Druze member of parliaments in both. Often lists and parties will even secure a special position within the party list for a Druze candidate to make it a more fair or level playing field, realizing that that is an important constituency, and that perhaps they even want to hold a special, like say the 14th slot or the 18th slot, depending on which party it is, specifically for Druze, even if normally, that may not be justified politically. It is because it's important to include them in the fold, and because they are so active in the legislative, politics, the economic life, academia, and government institutions. So I really appreciate that question. You can go down a Druze village or city and you see signs for opposing parties in the windows and people handing out flyers literally across the street from each other for opposing parties. And that is done in goodwill. Everyone wants to put their best foot forward, but there is no real issue with that.
Great. Democracy at its finest. I just want to address one question. Someone asked if it was possible to get a printout of the slides. There will be both a recording of this webinar, and we can distribute both the recording and the printouts. I'll work on getting that done via eBlast. So check your inbox in the coming week or so. Let's see, one other question is, how do you anticipate the increasingly Orthodox orientation of Israel will impact Israel's future?
That's a wonderful question. Of course, anyone that tries to look into the future, whether it's even just a year or 10 away, has to take demographic changes into account. The religious population of Israel does increase relative to the population as time goes by. Of course, some would argue there may also be a opening up of some societies that may have been more closed up in the past. It's very common for the ultra-Orthodox now to be working, whether it's men and women. Often women are actually the breadwinners, and men may bring in an income from studying at the yeshiva, but the women are often going out of the house. So a lot of the opinions that may have been in the past are changing. People don't only vote based on, the recommendation by maybe their rabbis or how they see it goes. So I think some folks may be becoming more secular from the religious. Of course, some secular people become Orthodox as time goes by, but there is that natural growth. The expectation is that Shas and United Torah Judaism, the two ultra-Orthodox parties, would continue growing. Now, Shas, as you see, only had a number of seats, I believe 9, but in the past they have already had 14 or 15. So just because a population grows, you can't automatically assume you know who people are voting for based on how religious they are or how they dress in the street. Of course, as a generality, you can make those, connections. And I realize that I have been guilty of that myself when talking about some of the populations that the parties represent within this presentation. But that is accurate, and we have to follow, we have to give facts as they are. Just because a party is represented, just because a party represents ultra-Orthodox, Arab, or secular does, of course, not mean that the secular Orthodox or Arab will vote for that particular party or vote at all. So all those different factors change. How do I see that affecting Israeli politics? I think that the religious and ultra-Orthodox segments of the population will continue to be important parts of the population. As their parts grow, I think it will be very interesting to see how that impacts the political landscape. It's important to note the religious parties are currently in the Netanyahu government and are currently in a LIKUD government. When Rabin and Peres were prime ministers, they were in the Rabin and Peres Labor government. And so these parties represent the interests of their population. And if they feel like it's the interest of their population to have the greater power by them being in government, to have access to greater budgets, perhaps, as them being the ministers themselves making those decisions. Maybe they want to have the education portfolio or the one dealing with transportation, so they can curb a little bit of of things on Shabbat. So I will posit that the religious or ultra-Orthodox parties will still join a center-left or left-leaning government if it is in their best interest. And I can tell you that as a rule, Israeli politicians and Israeli parties will always prefer to be in power, even if it's a shared power, or even if they're a junior coalition member, than in the opposition. So, so that is fluid, and that does change with time.
Great, thank you. Our next question, it's an important question because it is so different from how we vote here in the United States. We vote for you vote for a party.
Right.
How do you know who's going to be the prime minister?
That's a wonderful question, and it really, and here the system, it really does show how differently it is than the states in more aspects. Not to further complicate it, but each party makes up their own candidate list, and each candidate and their list literally is numbered. So, for example, for blue and white, Benny Gantz was number 1, and therefore, if that party garners the most votes, he would be the prime minister. So that's the example. The rest of the list is determined, the whole list is determined based on the voting of party members. So I can't just fly to Israel tomorrow and say, I want to vote, for this person or that person in this list. You have to be part of, you have to be, just a paying member with maybe with dues, maybe attending a certain amount of meetings every so often, and nothing too high up. The largest parties have tens of thousands of voters that make up these lists. The smaller ones have less. And Israel Beitenu, Lieberman's, is the only one where he is the arbiter, and he makes the list. He decides who the candidates are, and all that. Every other of the 7 parties that we covered, the members themselves vote for the people. If Benjamin Netanyahu got more votes than the next guy for Likud, he would be their number 1. The next person would be number 2, 3, and onward. The caveat to that is the larger parties do reserve certain seats for certain segments of the population because they want to appeal to a larger group and because they want to level the playing field. And therefore, the larger parties like Blue and White and Likud have certain seats that will be particularly for a Druze candidate, particularly several seats reserved for women candidates, though they would naturally be voted for anyway. They want to guarantee that there'll be at least a minimum amount of seats that would be reserved for those candidates, sometimes for an immigrant, sometimes it's specifically Soviet immigrant, Ethiopian immigrant. They want to have, without getting too detailed and too limiting of themselves, they want to appeal to this broad base. And if you want to be a national government in Israel or have a national party that appeals from the north to the south, you should represent the Olim from the different countries. You should represent, folks that are both on the right and left, or at least mostly down the middle, et cetera. So that's how those are determined. They are held in party primaries that are naturally held ahead of time before the election, well ahead. So by the time people come to the election, they know who's at what number. And therefore, ahead of time, if said party gets 18 seats, that, oh, this person I really like at number 20 is not going to make it, but you may try to vote for them anyway and try to get them in, et cetera. So you can almost predict based on how many seats a party will get, which candidates will make it into the Knesset and which ones may have to wait for their turn next time.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Okay, interesting. There are a couple questions. I'm not sure that either you or I are able to answer. The first, why hasn't Israel adopted a digital or electronic voting system since it is so advanced in technology?
Right. That's a wonderful question. I would suggest there are multiple issues or reasons. And of course, to many of us in the digital age, it may seem very basic to have folks stand in line, go into a booth, take a piece of paper, put it, and to physically have to count each one. Yet, I do want to also suggest that having that ability or having that basic rudimentary system can guarantee that you're getting accurate results, and you can always count them again and again. I would suggest that it is not an issue of cost or other limitations, but that it is an issue of security. And that if you are putting everything on, whether it's on the internet or on machines that were built by a corporation, whether it's within your country or in China or in a different country, that something can be put in that machine or to manipulate with it, to make it stop working, to make it malfunction. And I think that we've seen that here in our own elections with issues and questions and possible even questions of hacking and otherwise. And I think one of the strongest tools any government has, especially a government that purports to represent their populace, is to be able to demonstrate that those results are accurate. Because if you are building your whole reason of existence and legitimacy as a governing body on the vote of the people, you cannot have that vote being questioned, or that is a big issue, and that can cause lots of problems. I think that is the main issue. I don't know if it's going to continue the way it is now, or eventually there will be some kind of internal way to digitize it. But with Israel's size and with the amount of people working at polls come elections times, they are able to keep it up this way if they want to for a decade or two or much longer. I could see Israel's population doubling to 20 million and further, and they could still keep doing it this way if they choose.
Great, thank you for that.
My
we
pleasure.
have such an incredibly active chat and Q&A box. Thank you all so much for your interest and your questions. We have 5 minutes left, so we're going to go with 2 more questions.
I'll try to answer quickly so we can get as many of them addressed, and I appreciate the questions, folks.
So first one is, how is campaign financing handled? Are there any limits?
There are strict campaign financing limits. This is a huge part, and I'm very glad for that question. Whoever you are, thank you. The elections themselves are financed by the government. And so the government, it disperses funds to each government, to each party for their very basic needs. Of course, the parties have to make certain thresholds to be eligible for that. But the folks can finance themselves. I don't believe there's a limit to that. But there are strict limits to foreign money and internal money. And in general, Israeli politics are not dominated by expensive campaigns. There are plenty of ads. There are plenty of ads in the TV and in the newspaper, and it's plastered everywhere come election time. But it is not a very expensive thing to do. They are very strict about it. You don't see, there has never been a fundraiser in Israel that the prime minister walks into and has a big dinner at a nice hotel or somewhere else and can charge people, $100, $5,000 per head for such a thing. There's no such thing whatsoever. There are strict limits, which I encourage you to look up, but they're small. I believe it is maybe $500 or so per person per election cycle, something commensurate with that. Nothing too large, and there is no like super PAC type thing where you can go to some external group. That would not be allowed. That's outside of the scope.
Okay, all right. This one is we've only got 1 or 2 minutes left, and this is a big one, so maybe we have to gloss over it. If Netanyahu and Gantz were able to form a coalition, would that eliminate the ultra-Orthodox parties in such a way as to relax the controls over marriage, divorce, or IDF service as examples?
It very well can. It very well can. Currently, it seems there is, anyone that's following over the last week or longer, there are intense negotiations between the two parties, Likud and Blue and White, to enter into a government together. The current discussion is that Prime Minister Netanyahu would retain his seat for either a year and a half or two, and then he would automatically be succeeded by Benny Gantz. The formula they want to do that by is by having both of them sworn in as Prime Minister this week, and therefore when one expires, the other person has already been sworn in. So that's interesting. The question about excluding or keeping some of the religious parties out because of Blue and White coming in, I do want to mention something that hasn't come up before. Blue and White is not entering and is not negotiating to enter the government wholly. The part that is entertaining that is Benny Gantz's faction of Blue and White, which is 15 of the 33 seats. So if Benny Gantz joins in a national unity or in an expanded, wider government with Netanyahu, he would bring himself and 14 other members of parliament with him, not 33. So those 15 are, as you can see, only enough to replace the two ultra-Orthodox parties. It's not even enough without them to get to that 61 or better magic number. So this time, I don't think that's a possibility. The reason why I'm saying that is because Benny Gantz is not bringing in his full 33 parliamentary votes that he got in the election. When he decided to go from being a direct challenger to Netanyahu to possibly joining Netanyahu in a shared government, mostly he's saying because of the corona issue and the fact that this is a significant time for Israel and for all of us. He wants to enter a national emergency government. The other two partners, the other two parts of Blue and White completely dissolved the party right away. So they went from 33 to 15, and Benny Gantz is retaining the Blue and White name, and they will be their own party with 15 votes. The other 18 votes, the 15 for Yesh Atid and the 3 for Telem, will be in opposition, regardless. As long as Netanyahu is the prime minister, they said that they will not go into any national government with him. So this time, I can almost guarantee that the ultra-Orthodox parties will still be in government. If there are enough secular votes, or if it's important enough for folks in future elections to really have these two large parties not even come together, but both enter into a government, they would be able to do that by themselves. If you took all 33 from Blue and White and all 36 from Likud, that's 69. You don't need any other members of parties. You don't need further to the left. You don't need further to the right. You don't need the Arab parties or the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox parties. And just those two parties can rule. So that is possible. Again, the reason why that may be difficult is because they are always direct competitors for the power. So it would be almost like a smaller Democratic and smaller Republican government running together. Who's going to be in opposition, frankly, right? So it's possible that I see that being a possibility more, again, if it's required, whether health emergency that we're experiencing, financial emergency, or war, or a very serious national security issue. If they know that we are heading into some kind of showdown with Iran, or they know that something's coming, that's very likely that suddenly you don't want to then you start putting aside a lot of the day-to-day, disagreements and focus on some of the larger issues. We last had a national unity government in Israel between 84 and 88. 2 years, Prime Minister Shimon Peres was prime minister. He then was succeeded by Yitzhak Shamir. So you had Labor for 2 years, then Likud. And that was the last time they did that. The reason back then in 84 was there was quite an economic problem. That was the last big economic recession and issue in Israel. And that's what caused that. That's what prompted that.
Great. Thank you, David.
My pleasure. My pleasure. If some folks would like to stay on, I don't know if we have to end. If some folks would like to add some questions, I'm more than okay with staying on some more minutes, or please feel free to reach out to me by email, and I'd be happy to follow up. Perhaps we will have another talk like this or two in the future. It's really been great. Jessi, if we have time for another one, I'll take more, but if we have to finish up, I understand as well.
I appreciate your excitement. Unfortunately, we do have to end this. Again, you see David's email address on the screen. So if you have further questions, feel free to email him. And don't forget that coming in May, we will be having the Israeli embassy come to do a deeper dive and to answer some of more of these intricate questions about the current political system. So
I'm looking forward to that very much.
Yes.
Looking forward to that very much.
So thank you all so much for joining the Heller CRC's webinar about Israeli Politics 101. And keep out an eye on your inboxes for the recording of this webinar to share with your friends and family who couldn't join, and the slides that David prepared for us. Thank you all so very much.
Much appreciated. It's been a great time. I hope that it gives some clarity or some basis that the embassy can build on. I think that's going to be wonderful. We're really lucky to have Jessi reaching out and having such high-level Israeli officials that have really represented Israel throughout the world, in Europe and South America, and now in the States. They will be able to tell you about the current events, to tell you about their, countering any anti-Israel activity out there and fighting for Israel's image. In these times, that is almost as important as Israel's military edge or economic strength is Israel's image in the world. Anything that we can all do to support that and show people that it is a positive place that just wants to keep fighting for survival and flourish. Hopefully, one thing that can come out of this pandemic now is that Israel can hopefully also help with solutions as they're working on.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Have a good one.